I didn't lose my family the day I signed the revocation. I lost them years before, the moment my grandmother pressed pruning shears into my 12-year-old hands and told me the lemon tree didn't need permission to bloom. I just hadn't noticed yet. The kitchen table was cheap laminate dressed up with placemats. My father slid the papers across it the morning after my 18th birthday, one hand still holding his coffee. The stack was neat, professional. Just sign it, Imogen, he said. Let the family handle the money. I didn't reach for the pen. I looked at him, really looked, and asked, which family? The one that spent 4 months drafting a petition to declare me incompetent. His face did something I'd never seen before. A flicker. A recalculation. The mask slipping just long enough for me to see the man underneath counting his losses in real time. $3 million. That's what my grandparents left me. That's what my parents, my younger sister, a notary named Curtis, and a lawyer downtown had spent the better part of a year planning to take. They had forged documents. They had patience. What they didn't have was the one thing my grandfather taught me to read before anything else. The fine print. The summer I turned 12, my grandmother Coralie kept a greenhouse behind the old craftsman house, attached by a narrow door that always stuck in the humidity. The room smelled like wet soil and something sweeter I couldn't name then, Meyer lemon blossoms. I know now. The glass panes fogged every morning. The air inside was thick and warm and alive. She let me prune the lemon tree she'd grown from a cutting the year my father was born. She handed me the shears. She let me make mistakes. One afternoon I asked if she was worried I'd cut the wrong branch. She wiped her hands on her apron, the fabric stained green at the fingertips, and said, "The lemon tree doesn't ask permission to bloom, Imogen." I was 12. I thought she was talking about gardening. She wasn't. My grandparents were the only people in my family who treated my questions like they deserved answers. At home, a question was a problem. Something to be managed, redirected, shut down with a look across the dinner table that said not now, Imogen. In that greenhouse, a question was a doorway. My grandmother taught me which leaves meant the roots were drowning and which meant they were thirsty. She taught me that those two things looked almost identical until you knew what you were looking at. You don't soften for people, she told me once, snipping a dead shoot with a sound like a sigh, and you shouldn't. I held on to that the way other children held on to bedtime stories. I didn't know yet that she and my grandfather were already downtown, meeting with a lawyer, building something quiet and permanent with my name on it. Because they already understood something about my father that I wouldn't learn until it was almost too late. He read people like account balances. Decided what they were worth. Then collected. My grandfather August kept a desk in the front room with a brass lamp on it, the kind with a green glass shade and a pull chain that clicked when you turned it. That lamp was where he taught me numbers. Not arithmetic. Money. He'd spread the newspaper's business section across the blotter and make me read a balance sheet out loud. He showed me what a liability was. He showed me how compound interest worked, drawing the curve with a fountain pen until it bent upward off the page like a promise. Most people skim the top line and sign, he told me, tapping the paper. The story's always in the small print at the bottom. I was 12, and I thought it was a game. He didn't. One evening my father came in to say dinner was ready. He saw the papers spread out and frowned, the same frown he used when my mother overspent or when I asked too many questions in front of company. She's 12, Dad, why fill her head with all that? My grandfather didn't look up. He clicked the lamp off. Then on again. And said, because someday someone will hand her a contract and smile while they do it. Then he looked right at my father when he said it. The room got cold in a way I didn't understand. Later, drying dishes, I watched my father photograph the documents on the desk with his phone when he thought no one was looking. The blue screen glow on his face. The careful angle. The practiced quiet of someone who'd done this before. I didn't say anything. I filed it away the same place I filed everything that felt wrong but unprovable. A growing archive of moments that didn't fit the story my family told about itself. My grandfather slid a piece of advice across the desk that night, and it stuck for life. People who underestimate you are doing half your work for you. I never forgot it. Neither, eventually, would my father. In our house, my sister Sloane was the sun, and the rest of us arranged ourselves around her. She was 3 years younger. Easy in all the ways I wasn't. She smiled when adults wanted smiling. She didn't ask where the money went. I did. That made me the difficult one. I remember a dinner when I was 14. A credit card statement left on the counter. A charge that didn't match what my father had told my mother. That's a $900 dinner, Dad, you said it was a client lunch. The table went quiet. My mother set down her fork like she was disarming it. Imogen, That is so disrespectful. Asking a question wasn't disrespect. But in our house, the two had been welded together so long that nobody could tell them apart anymore. My father ran a small wealth advisory practice. The kind with his name on the glass door and framed certificates behind the desk. He wore competence like a good suit, tailored, expensive, slightly too tight. That night his phone buzzed during dinner. I watched his jaw tighten when he read it. He left the table to take the call in the garage. I caught a fragment through the door before it closed. Compliance review. I didn't know what it meant yet. Only that it scared him. My mother smoothed it over the way she smoothed over everything, with a bright voice and a tighter grip. Your father works very hard for this family, she said, looking at me, not Sloan. I nodded. Ate my dinner. Said nothing else. I had already learned that in this house, being right out loud cost more than being wrong quietly. I just hadn't decided yet to stop paying. My grandfather died when I was 15. On a Tuesday. Of a heart that just stopped arguing. At the reception, my father and my uncle stood by the window talking about the estate before the coffee was even cold. I stood near my grandmother and held her hand and watched them. 2 years later, the spring I was 17, my grandmother followed him. Near the end, she was thin and clear-eyed, and she held my wrist the way she used to hold the pruning shears. With intention. Don't let anyone tell you who you are, Imogen, she said. They'll try, they always try. I promised her I wouldn't. 8 months later, I was almost 18, and the house felt like a held breath. My parents had been gentle in a way that didn't fit them. One evening they sat me down with a thick folder of forms. These are just so we can keep helping with college and health insurance after you turn 18, my mother said, sliding a pen across the table. Adult stuff, boring. I was still raw with grief. Still half believing they were finally being kind. And I was so tired of being the difficult one. I signed where the little flags told me to sign. I skimmed the top lines. I did not read the small print at the bottom. The exact thing my grandfather had warned me about. For months later, I would learn what I had actually signed. I would understand that the kindness had been the bait. But that night, I just capped the pen, thanked them, and went up to bed feeling, for once, like part of the family. That feeling didn't survive the spring. The call came on a Thursday in February. 3 months before my birthday. From a number I didn't recognize. Imogen? My name is Patricia Lindquist. I was your grandparents' trustee. Her voice was flat and precise. Like someone reading a verdict she'd already decided was correct. She asked me to come to her office downtown. Alone. I went on a Saturday. Patricia was 63, gray-suited, with the calm of a woman who had spent decades watching families come apart over money and had stopped being surprised by any of it. She slid a folder across the desk. Your grandparents established a trust 6 years ago, she said, a brokerage portfolio, the Craftsman House, a rental building on Del Mar, roughly $3.4 million. You're the sole beneficiary. Under the terms, it was set to distribute to you outright on your 18th birthday. I sat very still. Outright, I repeated, meaning it becomes mine to control. She nodded. Then folded her hands. Which is why I called you early. Your father and uncle have been making inquiries about the trust, about its terms, about whether they could be named to manage it. The lamp in her office hummed. Your grandfather left instructions to warn you if that ever happened. He was very specific about your father. I asked her why. She looked at me for a long moment. Because he said your father reads people like account balances. He decides what they're worth, and then he collects. Then she asked the question that turned the whole room sideways. Imogen, there's a durable power of attorney on file with your father's name on it. Did you sign one? I thought about a thick folder. A bright voice. A pen sliding across the table. My stomach dropped. I don't know, I said. I think I might have. I went home and dug out my copy of the college and insurance folder. The one I'd signed in my grief without reading the bottom. I sat on my bedroom floor and turned every page. Tuition authorization. Healthcare proxy. 2 pages of insurance consent. And then, buried behind all of it, on a page I had initialed without reading, a durable power of attorney granting my father full authority over my finances. Effective, the clause said, upon my 18th birthday. My hands went cold the way they had the night my grandfather warned me. I called Saul Berman. My grandfather's CPA of 30 years. A blunt old man who still kept ledgers in his head. He met me at a diner and read the page twice. That's a durable financial POA, kiddo, he said, broad as a barn door. With this, your father can move money in your name the day you turn 18. Then he set the page down and looked at me carefully. Deciding something. There's more you should know, Your father's practice is under a FINRA examination. I do books for 2 of his former clients. Their statements stopped matching the custodian's records about a year ago. I asked him what that meant in plain words. Saul stirred his coffee. It means money that should be in client accounts isn't, and someone's been papering over the gap. If the exam finds it, he's barred. If it's bad enough, he's indicted. I felt the whole shape of it click into place. The $900 dinner. The garage phone calls. The sudden tenderness. The pen. He didn't want to help me manage my inheritance. He needed it to fill a hole before the auditors found it. That night I texted Patricia one line. I found the POA, we need to talk before my birthday. She answered in under a minute. Good, bring Saul. Patricia brought in a litigator named Bryn Holloway. 34. Fast talking with the energy of someone who enjoyed a fair fight more than a sure one. The 3 of them laid out the problem on a whiteboard like a chessboard. Here's where you're exposed, Bryn said. On your birthday, the trust distributes to you outright. The second it's in your personal accounts, that durable POA lets your father move it. We have to close that window before it opens. The plan had 2 moves. Both had to happen at the same minute. Your grandfather built a continuance provision into the trust, Patricia said. It gives me discretion as trustee. I can keep the assets in a protective trust for you, not hand them over outright, if you consent as the adult beneficiary. First, instead of taking the money outright, I'd consent and have Patricia decant the entire inheritance into a new irrevocable protective trust she controlled as trustee, locking it so that neither my father nor any power of attorney over me could reach it. Second, I'd sign a written revocation of the POA, and Bryn would send formal notice to the brokerage and the bank the instant it was effective. 12:01 a.m., the morning of your birthday, Bryn said. Not a minute later, if he gives the brokerage an instruction before our revocation lands, this gets ugly. I asked the obvious question. Why not just confront them now? Patricia answered without hesitation. Because if you warn him, he finds another road. Your grandfather didn't hire me to negotiate with your father, he hired me to lock the door. I asked if there was a risk they'd fight back. Bryn smiled like she'd been waiting for it. Almost certainly, people like your dad don't lose quietly. She capped her marker. But we don't hide, and we don't ambush, we lock the door, and we turn on all the lights. I drove home that night with a plan folded up in my chest. And I smiled at my father across the dinner table while he told me he was throwing me a big 18th birthday party. The week before my birthday, my father started circling. He found me at the kitchen table one night and pulled out a chair with the careful warmth of a man about to sell something. Can we talk, kiddo? Father to daughter. I closed my laptop and waited. Your grandparents left you a lot, he said, more than most adults know how to handle, let alone someone your age. I've managed portfolios for 20 years, let me carry that weight for you, just at first, so you can be a kid a little longer. It was a good pitch. Warm. Reasonable. Almost loving. I'd have believed it a year ago. I can carry it myself, Dad, I said. I read a balance sheet faster than you think. His warmth cooled by a degree. You're grieving, Imogen. You're not thinking straight. Grief makes people do reckless things with money. There it was. The first brick in a wall he was building. The word reckless laid down on purpose. I kept my voice level. I'm thinking straighter than I have in months. He studied me. Recalculating. I watched him decide I was a harder sale than he'd budgeted for. Just think about it, he said, standing. Don't do anything impulsive. After he left, I sat there with my grandfather's voice in my head. Clear as the click of that brass lamp. People who underestimate you are doing half your work for you. My father had just spent an entire conversation building the case that I was unstable. And he had no idea he was building it where I could see every brick. He thought he was managing me. He was narrating his own strategy to the one person it was aimed at. I went upstairs and texted Bryn. He's laying groundwork, calling me reckless and grieving. She wrote back, let him, document everything. My mother worked a different angle. Hers was quieter. Worse. She started seeding the family with a story. I caught the edge of it at a cousin's christening. My mother by the dessert table with my Aunt Helen, her voice pitched soft and concerned. We're just so worried about Imogen lately. She hasn't been herself since Mom passed. She's been so volatile. Volatile. The same family of words as reckless and unstable. Chosen and placed. She was building a character. And the character was a girl who couldn't be trusted with money. I didn't make a scene. I waited until we were home. Until she was unloading the dishwasher. I leaned in the doorway. Are you building a file on me, Mom? She didn't even flinch. I don't know what you mean. You told Aunt Helen I'm volatile. You've been telling people I'm not myself. She straightened up with a plate in her hand and gave me the wounded look she'd perfected over decades. "I'm your mother, I'm allowed to be concerned." From the next room, Sloane's voice drifted in. Careless and certain. "Mom said you'd try to keep all the money for yourself." The whole architecture of it landed on me at once. They hadn't just lied to me. They'd told my little sister a version of me, selfish, unstable, greedy, and she'd swallowed it whole. To Sloane, I wasn't her sister anymore. I was the threat the family was bracing against. "Is that what she told you?" I asked Sloane, keeping my voice even. She shrugged. "Already bored. Already on her phone." My mother set the plate down with a click that sounded exactly like a closing door. "Nobody's building anything, Imogen," she said. "You're proving our point right now." She wasn't wrong that it was a point. She was wrong about whose. The night before my birthday, I went out to the greenhouse. The Craftsman house still sat empty in trust. I had a key. I needed to be somewhere that smelled like my grandmother instead of my mother's careful poison. I carried my grandfather's brass lamp out there and set it on the potting bench and clicked it on. Green light pooling over the soil and the Meyer lemon tree she'd grown from a cutting. I checked the leaves the way she taught me. Thirsty, not drowning. I watered it. I didn't cry exactly, though it was close. What I felt was harder and cleaner than grief. It was the specific fury of being narrated as crazy by the people who'd spent 18 years deciding I was nobody. They'd told my sister I was greedy. They'd told my aunt I was unstable. They'd built a whole woman out of lies and handed her my name. I sat with the lamp in the tree and let the anger settle into something usable. They underestimated me. Good. I checked my email. Patricia had sent the full package. The new trust agreement. The revocation of power of attorney. The notice letters drafted and ready for Bryn to fire off at midnight. Everything flagged. Everything explained. Everything waiting on one signature. I read it all twice. The way my grandfather taught me. All the way to the small print at the bottom. The small print was clean. Then I closed the laptop and sat in the green light a while longer. The lemon tree quiet beside me. Blooming on its own schedule. Asking permission from no one. In a few hours I'd be 18. In a few hours after that, my family would discover that the difficult one had read every single page. At 11:50 that night, I sat at my desk with the brass lamp glowing beside the laptop and opened the video call. Patricia appeared first. Then Bryn. Both of them up at midnight like it was nothing. Both of them ready. "When the clock turns," Patricia said, "you'll be an adult, and the trust would normally land in your lap. We're not going to let it land where they can reach it." She walked me through it one last time. At 12:01, under the trust's continuance provision, I'd consent, and Patricia would decant the entire inheritance into a new irrevocable protective trust. One she controlled as trustee. One I held only as beneficiary. Meaning my father and any power of attorney over me would be reaching for a door with no handle on their side. Then I'd sign the revocation of the durable POA, and Bryn would transmit notice to the brokerage's compliance desk and the bank within the minute. "After tonight," Bryn said, "any instruction your father gives that brokerage gets flagged against a revoked authority and a retitled account. They won't move a dollar." The laptop clock turned over. 12:01. I picked up my grandfather's fountain pen. The one he'd used to draw that compound interest curve off the edge of the page. I signed the trust agreement. Then I signed the revocation. The weight of the pen felt like his hand on my shoulder. Bryn's screen lit as she fired the notices. Sent, timestamped 12:03 a.m. The brokerage and the bank both have it. Patricia gave me the closest thing to a smile I'd seen from her. "It's done, Imogen. You're the beneficiary of a trust no one in your family can touch." Downstairs, somewhere, my father slept beside a plan that had died at midnight and didn't know it yet. He'd find out at market open. I learned the rest later. In pieces. From what the brokerage logged. From what Bryn pulled in discovery. From what my sister eventually confessed. But here is what was happening across town while I signed. In Curtis Vance's home office, my father and Curtis sat over two sets of documents. Curtis was my father's old associate. A lawyer who notarized and filed things and didn't ask questions he wouldn't like the answers to. The first document was a set of brokerage instructions my father planned to submit at market open. Using the power of attorney to transfer the inheritance into an account he controlled. The second was an emergency petition for conservatorship over me. Claiming I was an 18-year-old too grief-stricken and financially reckless to manage a multi-million-dollar estate. Asking the court to appoint my father to manage my affairs. It was insurance. If the money moved clean, they wouldn't need it. If I fought, the petition would freeze everything and paint me as unstable in front of a judge. File the petition at 9 when the courthouse opens, Curtis said. Move the funds at market open, belt and suspenders. My mother had coached Sloane on what to say if anyone asked. That I'd been erratic. That I'd talked about the money strangely. They had built a machine with a part for everyone. What none of them factored in was the timestamp. The power of attorney they were counting on had been dead since 12:03 that morning. And the inheritance they were planning to move had a new trustee whose name was not Trask. They went to sleep certain. They woke up certain. They walked into the morning believing they held every card. Which is exactly the condition my grandfather had described to me at that desk when I was 12. Smiling while they did it. The party was the next afternoon. And it was a trap dressed as a celebration. My mother had invited the whole extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, my Aunt Helen, a few neighbors, under the banner of my 18th birthday and a little family meeting about Grandma and Grandpa's estate. There were balloons and a sheet cake and a banner that said, Happy 18th, in gold letters. And underneath all of it was a plan. I walked in already reading the room. My father was too relaxed. My mother was too attentive, touching my shoulder, calling me sweetheart in a voice she saved for audiences. Sloane wouldn't meet my eyes. Curtis Vance was there in a sport coat. Which meant nothing good. You don't bring your lawyer notary to a birthday party unless you expect to sign something. Aunt Helen sat near the window watching all of it with the same sharp stillness I recognized from my grandmother. She caught my eye once and held it a beat too long. Like she was trying to tell me something she couldn't say out loud. I got myself a paper cup of punch and stayed near the wall. And waited for my family to make the first move. Because I already knew they would. My father kept checking his phone. I knew why. He was waiting on a confirmation from the brokerage that the transfer had gone through. The confirmation that should have come at market open and hadn't. Every time he glanced down and saw nothing, his smile got a little more fixed. The cake sat uncut. My mother circled the room narrating my virtues to relatives in a way she never had before. Building me up so she could tear me down on cue. I sipped my punch. I let them set their own stage. My father tapped a fork against his glass when the room was full. The family went quiet and turned toward him. Before we cut the cake, he said, warm and easy, I want to say something. Mom and Dad left this family a real gift, and as a family, we've decided the responsible thing is to let me manage Imogen's inheritance while she finds her feet. We've decided. I hadn't decided anything. He looked at me with the practiced fondness of a man who'd rehearsed this. Right, sweetheart, you know this is what's best. Every face in the room turned to me. I felt the old gravity of it. The pull to smile and shrink and be easy. I set my cup down instead. I never agreed to that, Dad. A few relatives shifted. My father's smile held. She's overwhelmed. It's a big day. I'm not overwhelmed, I said, clear and level, and I know exactly why you need $3 million by this quarter. The room changed temperature. My uncle stopped chewing. My father's jaw flexed. Imogen. How's the FINRA exam going, Dad? I asked. The one about the client accounts that stopped matching the custodian's records? Somewhere behind me, a cousin whispered something. Curtis Vance set down his plate very slowly. My father's face did the thing it had done that morning. The thing I'd never seen before the inheritance came due. A flicker of pure calculation breaking through the warmth. People who underestimate you are doing half your work for you. He'd spent a week telling everyone I was a reckless grieving child. And now I was standing in his trap, calm, holding the one fact he most needed buried in front of every relative whose good opinion he lived on. He'd built the audience. I just used it. My mother stepped into the silence the way she always did. With tears already arriving on schedule. See? She said to the room, her voice trembling on cue. This is what we've been dealing with. She's not well. Ever since my mother died, she's been paranoid, accusing us of these awful things. We are trying to protect her. It was a masterpiece, honestly. She turned my composure into a symptom. She turned my accuracy into paranoia. A couple of the older relatives softened, nodding the way people do when a crying mother says she's only trying to help. I didn't raise my voice. Raising my voice was the gift she was fishing for. You're not trying to protect me, Mom, I said. You filed a petition at the courthouse to have me declared incompetent. You did that before you sang me happy birthday. A different kind of quiet fell. The kind where people start doing math. Aunt Helen's head came up sharply. My mother's tears paused, just for a half second. A crack in the performance. That's not, we were only exploring options. You hired Curtis to draft a conservatorship petition, I said, nodding toward him, and a power of attorney you tricked me into signing in a folder of college forms while I was grieving Grandma. I have both, so does my attorney. Curtis stood up like the chair had gotten hot. "I think this has gotten out of hand," he said, reaching for his coat. Aunt Helen spoke for the first time. Quiet and cold. Looking straight at my mother. "Renata, is that true? You filed to take her inheritance?" My mother turned to her sister with the wounded look ready to deploy. And for once, it didn't take. Helen had grown up with that look. She knew exactly what it covered. My father abandoned the warmth entirely then. Because it wasn't working. And what was underneath it had always been closer to the surface than he liked to admit. He crossed the room and lowered his voice so only the front half of the party could hear. Which was its own kind of theater. "You want to do this the hard way? Fine. We go to court." A judge looks at an 18-year-old with no job, no degree, sitting on $3 million, grieving, making wild accusations against her own parents. "You think you walk out of that with control? You'll have a conservator by summer, and it'll be me." It was meant to land like a fist. I'd spent a week being told I was reckless and unstable, and here was the threat the whole campaign had been building toward. Delivered in front of the family so they'd watch me crumble. I didn't crumble. "A court needs evidence I'm incapacitated, Dad," I said. "You don't have any. What you have is a power of attorney I revoked at 12:01 this morning, and a brokerage that's had formal notice since 12:03. His face went still. "And the inheritance you were planning to move at market open isn't in my name anymore. It's in an irrevocable trust. The trustee isn't a Trask." For a moment, he didn't breathe. Then he pulled out his phone, turned away from the room, and dialed a number I knew was the brokerage. Because I'd been waiting all afternoon for him to find out the hard way what I already knew. The party watched my father walk to the corner with the phone pressed to his ear. And watched his shoulders change as someone on the other end explained, very politely, that there was nothing he could do. I pieced together the brokerage call from the compliance log Bryn pulled later. But the shape of it was simple. At market open that morning, before the party, my father had already called once and given instructions to transfer the full portfolio using the power of attorney. The representative had put him on hold. "Come back." Told him the account had been retitled to an irrevocable trust overnight and the power of attorney on file had been revoked with notice received at 12:03 a.m. He'd argued. He'd insisted there was a mistake. The rep had stayed polite and immovable, the way they're trained to be, and had noted in the file that an attempted transfer had been made against a revoked authority. That note mattered more than my father understood. Now, at the party, he was calling a second time. In front of the family. Getting the same answer in real time. I watched it travel across his back and shoulders. When he turned around, the warm father was gone for good. What was left was a man who had bet everything on a door he could no longer open. "What did you do?" he said, low, crossing back to me. Not a question. An accusation. "I read the fine print," I said. "You taught Sloane to smile and you taught me to read. That was your mistake." Aunt Helen was already gathering her purse. Already done with the performance. Already on my side in the quiet way that would matter later. My mother had stopped crying because there was no longer an audience buying it. And Sloane, 16 and pale by the cake, was looking at me like a person watching a story she'd been told turn inside out in front of her. The party was over. The case was just starting. They went ahead with the conservatorship petition anyway. Which I think was pride more than strategy. The court set an emergency hearing for 10 days later. Bryn was almost gleeful about it. "They're walking into a probate courtroom to argue you're incapacitated," she said, "and we get to respond. We spent those 10 days building. Not hiding." Bryn filed a response opposing the petition and a separate motion challenging Curtis Vance for a conflict of interest. He couldn't represent my parents in an action against their own child while having drafted the very POA at the center of it. Patricia submitted the trust documents and an affidavit explaining the structure and the revocation timeline. Saul Berman prepared a sworn statement about my grandparents' clear intentions and their documented mental capacity when they created the original trust. And about the financial competence my grandfather had drilled into me since I was 12. I gave Bryn everything. The signed folder. The buried POA page. The dates. "Let them stand up in front of a judge," I told her, "and say out loud that I'm too unwell to be trusted with money." Bryn grinned. "Oh, they will, and then we get to ask them for their evidence. My father called me once during those 10 days. Late. His voice scraped down to the bone. "You're tearing this family apart, Imogen." I held the phone and looked out at the dark greenhouse across the yard of the empty Craftsman house. "I'm not tearing the family apart, Dad," I said. "I'm tearing your plan apart. Those aren't the same thing, no matter how many relatives you tell otherwise." He hung up. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired in a deep, structural way. Like a building that has held through a storm and is just now noticing the strain. But I wasn't moving. The morning of the hearing, my father caught me in the courthouse hallway before we went in. He looked like he hadn't slept in the 10 days since the party. The polish gone. The good suit hanging a little loose now. "It's not too late," he said. "Drop this, let me manage the money quietly, and I'll have the petition withdrawn. Nobody has to know any of it." I understood finally what he was actually asking. Not for my forgiveness. For my silence. He needed the inheritance to cover the shortfall before the FINRA exam closed in, and he needed me to hand it over and never say why. "How much is the whole, Dad?" I asked. He didn't answer. Which was an answer. 900,000? His eyes flickered. I knew Saul had been right. "I'm not giving you the money to cover what you took from your clients," I said, "and I'm not staying quiet so you can take it from someone else next." His face hardened into something I almost felt sorry for. A man watching the last exit close. "You do this to your own father. You did this to your own daughter," I said. "You just assumed I'd be too soft, or too sad, or too stupid to stop you. You spent 18 years deciding I was nobody." I picked up my bag. It made this easy. I walked into the courtroom and didn't look back. Behind me I heard my mother's heels and my father's slower steps and Curtis Vance somewhere arguing in a low voice that this was all a misunderstanding. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the most clearly I'd ever understood my family. The doors closed behind us. A clerk called the case. And the people who'd come to prove I couldn't be trusted with money sat down to make that argument out loud. The courtroom was small and bright and far less dramatic than television. Which somehow made it worse for them. Curtis Vance went first because my parents had insisted on going forward, and he stood and described me to the judge as a grieving, unstable young woman prone to volatile accusations, incapable of managing a multi-million-dollar inheritance without protection. He used my mother's exact words. Volatile, reckless, not herself. I sat very still beside Bryn and let him build the whole house. Then Bryn stood up. And she was almost gentle about it. Which is how I knew it was going to be bad for them. She established first that I was a competent adult with no medical history of incapacity. No diagnosis. No treatment. Nothing. That the entire claim rested on adjectives and a grieving family's word. Then she turned to Curtis. "Counsel drafted a durable power of attorney for the respondent 4 months ago," she said, "obtained while she was a minor, grieving her grandmother, buried in a folder of college paperwork. Counsel now represents the petitioners in an action to seize the very assets that power of attorney was designed to reach. That is a conflict of interest, Your Honor, and arguably worse." Curtis's face went blotchy. He started to object. The judge waved him down. Then Bryn produced the thing they hadn't planned for. "The petitioner's true motive isn't protection," she said, "it's liquidity, Mr. Trask's advisory practice is under a FINRA examination for a roughly $900,000 shortfall in client accounts. He needed his daughter's inheritance to fill that hole before the examination closed." A murmur ran through the gallery. Where I would learn afterward, a FINRA examiner had quietly been sitting since the doors opened. My father shot to his feet. "That's a lie," he said, too loud, his composure finally cracking open. The judge looked at him over her glasses. Unimpressed. "Sit down, Mr. Trask." He sat. The judge asked the only question that mattered. And she asked it plainly. "Counsel, setting aside the adjectives, where is your evidence that this young woman is incapacitated? A diagnosis? A medical opinion? A documented inability to manage her affairs? Anything?" Curtis shuffled papers that didn't contain the answer. "Your Honor, the respondent is 18. She has no professional experience. Being 18 is not a disability," the judge said. "Being inexperienced is not incapacity. I've read the trust documents. The assets are held by an independent professional trustee. There is, frankly, nothing here for a conservator to manage, even if I were inclined to appoint one, which I am not." She set the file down. Then she looked at my parents directly. And her voice changed. "What I see in this record is 2 parents who tricked their grieving child into signing a power of attorney, and who filed an incapacity petition the morning of her own birthday party. This petition isn't protection, it's a takeover." She denied it on the spot. She admonished my parents for abusing the process. And then she said the sentence that ended more than the hearing. "I'm directing the clerk to refer this matter, and the circumstances of that power of attorney, to the district attorney's office and the appropriate licensing authorities for review." My mother made a sound like the air had been knocked out of her performance for good. My father stared at the table. Curtis Vance was already calculating his own exposure. Because a lawyer who notarizes a fraudulently obtained POA and then litigates against the victim has a bar complaint with his name on it. And he knew it. I didn't gloat. I'd promised myself I wouldn't. And more than that, there was nothing in me that wanted to. I just sat there, steady, while the machine my family had built to declare me nobody came apart in a public room. Exactly where my grandfather had always told me these things get decided. Sloane found me in the hallway afterward while our parents were still inside with Curtis and the wreckage. She'd sat through the whole hearing. She looked younger than 16. The way you do when something you were certain of turns out to be a lie. They told me you were trying to take everything, she said. Her voice was small. They said you were greedy, that you didn't care about us. I didn't soften it for her. But I didn't aim it at her, either. I know they did, Sloane. You were a kid they handed a script to. That's on them, not you. She looked at the closed courtroom doors, then back at me. The money was really yours? Grandma and Grandpa really left it to you? They left it to me because they trusted me with it, I said, and because they knew Dad would try exactly this. I reached into my bag and took out the copy of my grandmother's last letter to me. The one Patricia had kept and given me after. I held it out. Read this when you're ready. It's her, not their version of her. Sloane took it with both hands like it might break. She didn't cry, and neither did I. And we didn't hug because 18 years of a wedge doesn't dissolve in a hallway. But something cracked open in her that afternoon. A first hairline split in the story she'd been raised inside. And for the first time in a long time, my little sister looked at me like a sister instead of a threat. It wasn't reconciliation. It was the possibility of it. Which after that morning felt like more than I'd expected to walk out with. Our parents came through the doors then. Gray and silent. And Sloane stepped a little closer to me instead of to them. The fallout came fast once the dam broke. And it came with numbers. The FINRA examiner who'd been sitting in the gallery didn't need much after that hearing. The shortfall in my father's client accounts was real. And within 6 weeks, he was barred from the securities industry for life. The bar meant his practice was finished. All of it. Worse for him, the matter went where those things go when client money is involved. The SEC opened a civil case. And the district attorney started looking at whether the missing $900,000 crossed from negligence into theft. He hired a defense lawyer. He stopped wearing the good suit because there was nowhere left to wear it. I didn't celebrate any of it. The truth is, it made me sad in a complicated way. Watching a man dismantle his own life and then look around for someone to blame. His eyes always landing on me. He called once more after the bar came down. I hope you're happy, he said. I hope this is what you wanted. It isn't what I wanted, Dad, I told him. It's what you did, you keep mixing those up. He didn't have an answer for that. And I didn't need one. The money he'd tried to take from me had never been the danger to him. The danger was always the gap he'd dug himself and papered over. The one my inheritance was supposed to fill. The one he'd have filled with the next person's money if I'd handed mine over quietly the way they'd all assumed I would. I hadn't handed it over. And so the floor he'd been standing on for years finally gave out exactly where he'd hollowed it. My mother's fallout was quieter. And in its own way more total. She had built her whole self on an image, the devoted mother, the woman who held the family together, the one the relatives admired at every christening and holiday. That image did not survive the story of a mother who tricked her grieving daughter into signing away her rights and then filed to have her declared incompetent on her birthday. The district attorney's office opened a file as the judge had directed. The relatives who'd nodded along at the party did the math afterward and stopped calling. Aunt Helen, who had watched it all happen and said the one true sentence in that room, became the family member I actually talked to now. While my mother sat in a house that had gone very quiet around her. Curtis Vance lost more than a client. Bryn filed a formal complaint with the state bar. A lawyer who notarizes a fraudulently obtained power of attorney and then litigates against the victim of it has stepped over a line the bar takes seriously. A disciplinary investigation opened against him. He'd spent years being the friend you call when you don't want a lawyer who asks questions. It turned out the questions catch up to you eventually. None of them apologized. That's the part people always want. The apology. The moment where the people who hurt you admit it and ask to be let back in. It didn't come. And I stopped waiting for it. Because I finally understood that waiting for an apology is just another way of letting them hold the pen. I had the trust. I had the truth on a court record. I had a little sister starting to come back. I decided that was enough. And then I went to the greenhouse. The Craftsman house was mine now. Free and clear inside the trust. The first thing I did was move my grandfather's brass lamp back to his desk where it belonged. Then I went out to the greenhouse and checked the Meyer lemon tree. The one my grandmother grew from a cutting the year my father was born. Thirsty, not drowning. I watered it. In the desk drawer, where Patricia told me it would be, I found a letter in my grandfather's handwriting. The loops going looser toward the bottom the way they always did when he was tired. He'd written it years before he died and left it with Patricia to give me when it was over. He told me he'd watched my father his whole life learn to read people for their worth and collect. And that he'd hoped he was wrong about where it would lead. He told me he'd chosen me to carry the trust not because I was easy, he knew I wasn't, but because I was the only one in the family who asked whether the lemon tree needed water before anyone asked what the house was worth. And at the bottom, in the small print where he'd taught me the real story always lives, he'd written one line. You never needed permission, you only needed time. I sat with that in the green light for a long while. My grandmother had told me the lemon tree doesn't ask permission to bloom. And I'd spent 18 years in a house that demanded I ask for everything. To speak. To question. To exist without apology. My grandfather had simply made sure that when the time came, I'd have the ground to stand on while I stopped asking. I folded the letter. The tree was budding. I left it to bloom on its own schedule. Patricia called the following week to close the loops. The protective trust was airtight and permanent. The revoked power of attorney was dead on the record. The conservatorship was denied with prejudice, meaning my parents couldn't simply refile it next month. The portfolio, the craftsman house, the rental building on Delmar, all of it sat safe under her trusteeship with me as beneficiary. And the income from the Delmar building alone would cover my life while I studied. Your grandparents structured this carefully, she said, they thought about every door. Then she mentioned one more thing. Almost as an afterthought. The way she delivered everything. There's a separate education fund. Your grandfather opened a 529 college account for you when you were 12 and seeded it with $50,000. It's been invested ever since. It's at about 63 now. I had to sit down. $63,000 my grandfather had quietly invested for me in a college account when I was a kid. Reading balance sheets at his desk. Never mentioned. Just there, growing. I enrolled at the state university that fall. Finance and accounting. Because of course it was. I moved into the craftsman house with the greenhouse out back and the brass lamp on the desk where it had always been. The first night, doing my own books at that desk under that green light, I thought about how my father had spent 20 years managing other people's money into a hole. And how my grandfather had spent 12 years teaching a little girl to read the bottom of the page. 2 ways to handle money. Only one of them had left anything standing. I clicked the lamp off. Then on again. Then I got to work. I met my parents once more. Months later. At a coffee shop on neutral ground. Because I decided how this would work, and I wanted to say it to their faces. They came in older than I remembered. My father's case was still grinding along. My mother had stopped pretending the relatives would come back. I'm not here to punish you, I said when the cups were on the table. I'm not interested in that, but I'm also not going to pretend none of it happened. My mother started. We only ever wanted. I stopped her. Not unkindly. Mom, you filed to have me declared incompetent. You told Sloan I was greedy. You went through my grief looking for a signature. I'm not going to argue about whether you meant well. I'm telling you the terms. They both went quiet. If you want me in your lives, it's on honesty, I said. No managing me. No version of me you sell to relatives. No asking me for money to fix what you broke. That's the door. It's open, but you don't get to decide who I am to walk through it. My father looked at the table. My mother's eyes were wet. And for once I couldn't tell if it was performance or not. And I realized I no longer needed to know. I'll call you on Sundays, I said, standing. We can try. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't a reunion. It was a boundary with a door in it. Which was more than they'd offered me in 18 years. And exactly as much as I was willing to give. I left enough for the 3 coffees and walked out into the afternoon. Sloan came to the craftsman house on a Sunday in early summer. Holding the letter I'd given her in the courthouse hallway. She'd read it more than once. I could tell by the soft edges of the paper. We sat in the greenhouse, and she looked at the lemon tree and the brass lamp I'd carried out to the potting bench, and she said, I'm sorry I believed them. I told her the truth. You were a kid in a house that lied to you. You believed the people who were supposed to be telling you the truth. That's not a crime, Sloan. It's just the start of figuring out who actually was. She nodded. Turning the letter over in her hands. Grandma sounds different in this than the way Mom talked about her. That's because it's actually her, I said. We didn't fix everything that afternoon. There were 16 years of being raised on opposite sides of a lie between us. And you don't clear that in one conversation in a glass room. But she asked if she could come back. And I said anytime. And I meant it the way my grandmother had meant things. She helped me water the tree before she left. Careful with it. Asking which leaves meant thirsty and which meant drowning. And I showed her the way I'd been shown in the warm room that smelled like soil and citrus. The one part of my family that had never once asked me to be smaller than I was. I still get up early and take my coffee out to the greenhouse. Because it's the one room that taught me the truth before I had words for it. The lemon tree is taller now. It blooms when it blooms. I didn't win against my family. There's no winning when the people who were supposed to protect you are the ones you had to protect yourself from. Nobody hands you a trophy for surviving that. But I kept the promise I made my grandmother, that I wouldn't let anyone tell me who I was. And I stood on the ground my grandfather made sure I'd have. And I did it without raising my voice once. My father read people for their worth and collected. And it left him with nothing. My grandfather taught a 12-year-old to read the bottom of the page. And it left me with everything that mattered. If you're listening to this and your own family has decided you're the difficult one, the unstable one, the one who can't be trusted, let me tell you what I finally learned in that glass room. You don't owe anyone the smaller version of yourself they find easier to manage. The lemon tree doesn't ask permission to bloom. I stopped asking, too. I just made sure, first, that no one could ever cut the root.